Good morning. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. It is the morning and a nice fall morning of Saturday, November the 8th, 2025. And I guarantee you that there are U.S. citizens being born all over the world today, including outside the United States. And this, of course, raises questions in the lives of their parents. And in order to discuss that with me today, I welcome back my longtime guest, Virginia Torre Jeker. I consider her to be the world's favorite tax lawyer, speaking with me today from Dubai. So, Virginia, what's happening?
Hi, John. How are you?
I am well.
Okay, glad to hear it. Well, I think 9 hours later here in Dubai. It's 6:20 p.m.
There's still
And
U.S. citizens being born there.
that's right. That's right. They certainly are. And today we have a great topic for all of those U.S. citizens who are being born abroad because they are faced with a bit of a dilemma. Their families are faced with a bit of a dilemma.
That's right. Isn't it interesting how, when it comes to some of the greatest joys in life, children being born, inheritances, etc. All of these things cause extra anxiety for a U.S. citizen. Isn't that all because of citizenship taxation, right?
That's right. It's um it's a
It's a,
time of anxious decisions.
a
So
truly amazing thing. Why don't we start with what the law says on this issue? Can
okay.
you help us with
So
that?
let's start with that. Under the US immigration laws, if the American parent, okay, so you have a child who's born of a US citizen parent and a foreign parent, and they are born outside of America. We are specifically looking at that child who was born overseas. And the US immigration law says that provided the American parent satisfies this relatively simple test that he has had, or at least she or he has had at least 5 years of physical presence in the US, with 2 of those years being after they were age 14, then their child who was born abroad will automatically, as a matter of law, by operation of law, be a US citizen. Full stop.
Hey, all right. Now that's interesting. Now, could I ask you this? Does it matter whether the parents are legally married or not on that test?
I don't know the answer to that, John. That's changed over the
But
years.
let's assume for the purposes of discussion without deciding, let's assume, all right, that we have
I don't think
uh,
it matters.
okay.
I don't think it matters. I know it under the old law, they discriminated against women. And, if the woman was unmarried and she was the US citizen, she couldn't pass the citizenship to the child. But all of that has changed as far as I know. Now,
Okay.
neither you nor I are immigration lawyers, so we would have to really look at the law and see how it's developed. But I think in today's day and age, it doesn't. It
Okay.
doesn't.
All right. Well, it's the statute's there. I mean, it's probably stated or not stated. But okay, so let's, we'll park that issue. But the key question is that the child is born to a U.S. citizen parent. And there has to be the U.S. citizen parent had to have physical presence of 5 years, 2 years after the age of 14. Okay.
Hmm.
So, what's going on in the minds of the U.S. citizen parent when the child
Well,
is
the
born?
US citizen parent, some of them, think, should I get a US consular report of a birth abroad? Because that consular report, and it will, if the child is proven to be a US citizen by the parent having at least the 5 years of physical presence, 2 after the age of 14, this is essentially their birth certificate. Okay. This is saying you are an American citizen by matter of law because you have been issued this US consular report of birth abroad and you can get your US passport. These are formal proofs of US citizenship, but they are not what create the US citizenship. What creates it is having the US citizen parent meeting that physical presence in the United States and as an operation of law, the child becoming a US citizen. from
All
that
right.
parent.
Yeah. So now I think this is hugely important, when you look at online discussions on this issue, whatever. So to be crystal clear, you can get a certificate of birth abroad because you are a U.S. citizen. The certificate of birth abroad does not somehow transform you into a U.S. citizen, correct?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think there is a lot of confusion with that because parents will say, oh, my kid's not a U.S. citizen because we never registered him.
Okay. So to put
So,
it in tax speak, though,
yeah,
that would mean that this would be a U.S. citizen from birth, correct?
that's right.
All
That's
right.
right.
And that, of course, has possible huge implications down the road, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here we have this dilemma, if you will, or this question to register or not to register. That is the
Yeah.
question. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where do you want to start? To register or to not register?
Well, I think let's look at let's look at the legal reality that this registration is merely evidence. It doesn't create the citizenship. So we know in our example that the child is a U.S. citizen from birth, okay? Regardless of whether the parents ever get the certificate of birth abroad or a U.S. passport for the child. But this issue can surface years later. And I think that's what we need to get people to think about. We're not saying register or not register. We are saying these are the issues you need to think about. So, for example, a practical complication will arise. For example, the child will never have a U.S. Social Security number. And if later on in life that child growing up wants to go to school in America or work in America, they're going to need a Social Security number. And getting a Social Security number after the age of 12, when you have never been issued such a number, is extremely complicated and slow. I mean, it can take years to get that. And the proof that's required is very, very onerous. You need to prove that you've been living overseas. I think it's like since the age of 5. And where do you get that? You need to get report cards, you need to get school transcripts, maybe you need to get job history, depending how old you are when you're trying to get your Social Security number. And you also have to have like an in-person interview and submit this proof to them. And not every consulate or embassy has what's called a federal benefits unit to be able to help you with that kind of Social Security issue. So you may have to travel to America. You may, and that presents another dilemma. Like if you're going into the States,
How do you enter the country? How would you
how
enter
do
the
you
country?
enter the country? You don't have a U.S. passport, but you're a U.S. citizen and the law mandates if you're a U.S. citizen, you enter and leave on a U.S. passport. So it just leads from one complication to the next. Okay. So that's one issue is not having the Social Security number.
So just to pause and keep track of what your points here, which I think are very important ones. So on the argument for registering the child, right? It's a fast track to a social security number, right? That's your point. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, let's
And
keep track of that because I think that is actually important. All right.
it's important. So, without that Social Security number, they can't work legally in the United States or even invest in U.S. markets. I mean, if you want to invest in U.S. markets, you need to fill out for that brokerage firm, you need to fill out paperwork regarding your U.S. or non-U.S. status. And typically they're giving you a W-9 if you're a U.S. person, or a W-8 BEN, W-8 BEN if you are a non-U.S. person. And while many people aren't sure what they are and they'll fill out the W-8 BEN, some of these people may actually know, oh, technically I'm a U.S. citizen, but I've never done anything to be acknowledged. My parents never filed, and submitted my documents to show I was given my birth abroad and have a U.S. citizenship from birth. they never did any of that. So, gee, I guess I'll just do a W-8 then, even though I'm technically a U.S. citizen. That can lead into serious problems later.
And of course, though, the W-9 does require the inclusion of the Social Security number, I assume, right?
Absolutely, yes, it
Okay.
does.
Yeah. So
Yes,
that's an interesting issue.
so,
On that
that's another
point,
problem.
yeah, of course, you can't file taxes without, as a U.S. citizen, without a Social Security number. But I think it's worth noting, as you know, the relief procedures for former citizens on
Yes,
renunciation. That's
yes.
why they don't include a requirement of a Social Security number. Interestingly.
That's right. That's right. So people that want to renounce their citizenship can use that procedure and, you know, formally renounce. And then when they're done, they file their tax returns for 5 years, provided they don't have the 2 million net worth or the income tax liability issue. They will be, spared from being treated as covered expatriates, even though they have not filed returns before and not been tax
Right.
compliant. So this is a very special procedure. And, people who use it are blessed if they can use it, but it's not, the factors aren't all that easy to get into, predominantly because I forget what that low threshold is. You can't have
25,000.
Okay, over 6 years, you can't have a tax liability over that 6-year
Yeah.
period, 5 years prior and the expatriation year, over 25,000 US dollars. If you have a lot of foreign tax credits from your country, that might work well, but a lot of people don't have foreign tax credits and, they're over the 25,000 and they can't use this procedure.
Yeah, and that can definitely be a problem. But again, coming back to Social Security number, it shows you. I think that people don't understand how important a Social Security number is, right? In so many aspects of dealing with the United States, right?
If you
Uh,
don't have that number, I mean, you can't do anything.
yeah,
Everything asks for an SSN.
and maybe you view that as good, maybe you view it as bad, but I think it's important for people to understand
That's right. I mean,
that that
college
is an issue.
applications,
Yep,
right?
that's
Scholarship
right.
applications, all of these online forms, they're asking you for that SSN. They're assuming that citizens have a social security number. So, yeah, troublesome, very troublesome. So, if
Okay,
the person is eventually going to acknowledge U.S. citizenship, then they have to catch up on, missed tax filings. And, the IRS does have like streamlined programs and all. But they're going to need to get through an awful lot of hoops to be able to get that SSN and correct their filings.
right. Okay, so that's one good argument for registration as a U.S. citizen. I think a second one might be just on visiting the United States, right? I mean,
Hmm.
how does, the U.S. citizen parent bring the child to the United States, right? For visits.
They can. I mean, it's going to be tough. If they're going in on a foreign country passport, ugh, I wouldn't want to be doing that. But
Well, we've got the rule that a U.S. citizen is required to enter the United States on a U.S. passport, right? So here's a situation I've seen enough times so I remember it, is, the parent's a U.S. citizen, goes to visit America, brings the child. Child is a U.S. citizen, but not
not registered.
documented,
Uh-huh.
registered, whatever. What happens then? I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it?
What does happen then? What inquiries are made? What
Well,
questions are
they know
asked?
they make inquiries. I mean, that in itself is a big enough problem, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I
absolutely.
haven't heard of any situation where, no, you can't, bring in the child. I haven't heard of that. But I mean, it does make it an awful lot easier traveling to the United States, obviously, right?
Of course.
So
And
there,
then we have the problem with financial institutions, John. So we have, the Social Security issue. People can overlook this financial institution issue that they will be faced with. So we all know about FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. It requires non-U.S. financial institutions to look for, any U.S. citizens or U.S. persons who have accounts at the financial institution. So the financial institution is looking for, any kind of U.S. indicia. Now, they are not typically asking the client or onboarding client whether the parent was a U.S. citizen at the time the client was born. I've never seen that question arise.
Yet.
But I believe that question may come down the road. And you and I have talked about this. So it's out there. I would also caution that when the U.S. citizen parent has an account at the foreign bank, let's say, if they make the child who's not registered like a signatory or a joint account holder, that might raise questions, okay? Because they might be linking, it could trigger increased inquiry about this person. Why are they giving me a W-8 Ben when they're your son and you're a U.S. citizen? What's the deal? So while there is no requirement to ask these kinds of questions, I think there is a risk of linkage through related party kind of connections that people should not overlook. And I think down the road, these questions may become more probing with foreign financial institutions.
Well, Virginia, I mean, it's really the same thing, isn't it, as traveling to the United States, right?
Yep.
The family, right? It's really the same kind of principle again. And, I mean, this is, this is an issue. I mean, it may or may not arise, but, these are the kinds of things that can happen when, there's no clarification on the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
now we've talked about, so, I mean, they're clear, regardless of your position on any of this, there are clear advantages to having a social security number, right? And there are clear advantages to getting the certificate of birth abroad. There are
Yes.
clear advantages to that. No
And other
question.
people will say there's clear disadvantages, John.
Sure they would. So, and there are. So let's talk about that. What would be the disadvantages?
Well, the disadvantages, once I've acknowledged the U.S. citizenship, I become responsible for U.S. tax filings, paying tax on worldwide income, reporting all my foreign financial assets, FBAR, and so forth. So that is a discouraging factor for people that live their entire life abroad and don't feel they have a U.S. connection other than this, I was born an American citizen by happenstance. Another problem can be that some countries don't permit dual nationality. So people are afraid because they're living in the country of their other citizenship. They are afraid to document their U.S. nationality. So,
Yeah. And there are a few countries that actually have requirements to report multiple citizenships, right?
yeah,
Russia is one of them, for example.
correct.
Yeah. So, and, it's not just the, the whole U.S. aspect of this, but I mean, certainly the U.S. consulates are well aware of this as a problem, right? In many countries.
Oh,
So,
they're definitely aware of it, but I think the concern for let's say, the parent of the child is if somehow it gets revealed or they learn that my child has this U.S. citizenship, then they may do something like strip him of his other country's citizenship, something,
yeah,
or
or it
there'll be
create
repercussions.
or it
So,
creates the legal predicate to do that. I mean, a few years ago in Canada, they changed
mhm.
the law, but I think it was under the Harper government. They created a law that would have allowed the government of Canada to strip people of Canadian citizenship if they had another citizenship.
Wow.
Right. So, I mean, this is, this stuff is huge, right? And there's so many implications to this kind of thing. I mean, if you can understand half of them, you're probably doing well, right? But, there are definitely reverberations and repercussions to this type of stuff, in various parts of the world, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, this is a very personal decision. It's not a legal loophole not to register the kid. It's not going to change the fact that he or she is, by operation of U.S. law, an American citizen.
But it does defer the practical reality of it.
That's correct. That's
Yeah.
correct. And, some of these delays are viewed positively by the family. But I think one thing we can mention is that, look, I think the privacy calculus is changing dramatically since we have FEC, we have the Common Reporting Standard. And I think at the moment, even if the foreign financial institutions aren't explicitly asking about parents' citizenship, the web of cross-reference data means that these connections are going to be harder to conceal, basically. So they may be picked up at some point. They may be picked up.
Should I read in what the FATCA legislation says on this or not?
Well, it can hurt, John. I mean, you and I have read this. We think it gives the financial institutions, clearly gives them scope to be asking.
Yeah, I think I'm going to read this in. I don't think that we're anywhere near this, but it does show, how the extent to which this can be pushed, particularly, today, Jesse Drucker, is a New York Times columnist, had a great article in the New York Times talking about, how consequential Treasury's regulatory authority is on the interpretation of taxation laws, which you, of course, would know.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what the statute actually says, right? So this is section 1471 of the Internal Revenue Code. And this lays out the requirements of foreign financial institutions to basically report, report on their U.S. citizen clients, right? But reporting requirements.
This section that you're going to read to us is what the foreign financial institution is essentially instructed about finding U.S. citizens or U.S. persons in their database who have accounts with them. This is
or prospective, clients. I mean, this is section 1471 with titled "Withholdable Payments to Foreign Financial Institutions." Right. And here's paragraph B: reporting requirements. The requirements of this subsection are met. In other words, you have to find, U.S. citizens, right? With respect to any foreign finance, if an agreement is in effect between such institution and the secretary, under which such institution agrees. Okay, now here's the key language. To obtain such information regarding each holder of each account maintained by such institution as is necessary to determine which, if any, of such accounts are United States accounts, right?
correct. So
Very broad, very broad.
Yes.
That's
To
not
obtain
restricted.
such information regarding each holder of each account maintained by the institution as is necessary to determine which, if any, of such accounts are United States accounts. So it is
Very broad.
Obtain such information. And they can be asking then later on, either of your parents were U.S. citizens when you were born?
Well, we're not there. We're not there,
but we may get there.
My point is the legislation is clearly broad enough to contemplate that without any difficulty at all, I think. Do you agree?
I agree, yes. I agree.
Anyway,
but
so
let's look at the bright side and let's say the parent decides we're going to register the child. And they will be then, acknowledged as a U.S. citizen from birth, and we have the passport and everything else. So what can that parent do to maybe prevent, let's say, unwanted U.S. tax issues for the child? So they can support the child, of course, pay for their schooling and so forth and so on. And maybe the kid is not working any, part-time jobs or so. And now he's approaching the age of 18 and he can formally renounce his U.S. citizenship. That's not bad. And what the law even permits, they say, even if you're like a squillionaire because one of your parents died and left you all this inheritance money, so even if you are over that $2 million net worth and you want to get rid of your U.S. citizenship, So long as you do that before you reach the age of 18 and a half, and you have not had any kind of significant presence in America over the past 15 years, then you can have that extremely wealthy background in your net worth and not be treated as a covered expat. So there is an exception for minors who expatriate and have not had significant physical U.S. presence prior to their expatriation. They
Yeah,
can,
I
they
believe
can
that.
have.
Yeah, I believe they have to still certify 5 years of compliance.
That's correct. You do have to still be U.S. tax compliant, but I'm assuming most of them can easily do that.
I'll tell you an area that I've seen where it's difficult, and this I think comes close to advice. There are certain reporting requirements under the Internal Revenue Code that require form filing, regardless of whether you have to file a tax return, right?
Yes.
I think the mutual fund issue is one, the 3520, and the
5471.
yeah, exactly. So would you endorse the following general advice, right? Make sure that the child is not involved in anything that requires reporting separately from the requirement to file a tax return. Would you agree with that?
Yes, if that can be done, it's certainly a great thing, because if they had to file a Form 5471, for example, because they own shares in a company, a foreign company that requires that kind of reporting, even if they have never received a penny from that foreign company or any other money that requires them to file an income tax return, they are still going to be required to file the special Form 5471, reporting their ownership in the foreign company. And yeah, if you don't do that, then you haven't been fully tax compliant for the 5 years prior to expatriation. So
So I'm
if,
going to give you this is a national question somebody asked me a while ago, and I'll tell you how he answered. And you can tell me what you think of my answer. It was sort of this type of situation. Somebody in their early 20s, dealing with this sort of undocumented U.S. citizenship status,
hmm
probably didn't have to file a tax return because it didn't meet the income thresholds, but
hmm
was ready to set up a a corporation, a small business, wanted to get started with a corporation. And I said, don't do that. Don't run your business through a corporation because of the reporting. Was that good advice?
I think, John, yes, in a way it was good advice. So how are they going to run their business then?
Oh, just as an individual.
Sole proprietorship.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And you don't think they were going to meet the requirement to file a tax return based on that?
Well, they hadn't so far. They hadn't so
Okay.
far. But I mean, this was in the context of, let a lot of people for fun, they think, wow, this is exciting. I'm going to go out and create a corporation today.
Yeah, they're not thinking.
Well, it's not, they're not. There's this, nobody could even make up these rules, right? But, where
Mhm.
this matters is, I mean, somebody like that, even if they're over the age of 18, could renounce U.S. citizenship as long as they're compliant with the Internal Revenue Code, right?
Mhm.
Now let's say that they haven't met the threshold requirements to file. They're presumptively compliant unless they're involved in some activity that requires some kind of independent reporting, right?
Yes.
So, what that does do, among other things, I think, leaves open the possibility of being able, say you're going to use the dual citizenship from birth option, right? To be able to
Mhm.
certify tax compliance, right? Without actually even having filed a tax return. Now, whether maybe you still want to file $0, or something, right? Maybe you do, right?
Mhm.
But and the point is that to get into these types of entity creation things, right?
Yes, you keep the trouble.
Well, you're closing off simple options to get out of U.S. citizenship, aren't you?
Yes, you are.
So, I mean, I think that's an important consideration
I
on
agree.
this. Yeah, because it's interesting when you look around the world, right? There's what I would call a culture of small business corporations, right?
Yes, yeah.
Many countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, possibly the UK. have sort of a culture of creating these things, to create separate tax entities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the presumption in the U.S. law is that, anybody who has a corporation is clearly up to no good, right? So
Unfortunately, that is a little bit in the minds of the tax authorities, yes.
yeah, just a little bit, yeah. Yeah, so where are we? So those are, other disadvantages. I don't know. I mean,
Well, I think we've covered them, okay? I think what we really want to emphasize is that US citizenship, once it's transmitted in the manner we've talked about with that US parent who's met the physical presence in the United States to pass it on to his child, even though the kid is born overseas. US citizenship, once it's transmitted, it's not like a switch that you can quietly turn off. It's there, okay? And it's there, and the only way out of it is really to formally renounce it later on. So if that's the route people take, I think in a way it's the cleanest route. They know it's done, right? And there are little planning opportunities you can use to make sure that until you have the opportunity to renounce, that you're not having to file, like you say, these information returns. You're not maybe working because you're still a young person and you're going to renounce before you reach the age of 18 and a half and so forth. There are things you can do to kind of mitigate the U.S. tax and reporting exposure that you're going to have.
yeah, and I think, on the bright side, right? I mean, look, U.S. citizenship is a problem because of the tax stuff, but it's also an opportunity. I mean, it's not like, there aren't opportunities in the United States. So on balance, I mean, if they can keep their U.S. citizenship, I mean, I think it's probably a good thing. My general view is that people should not renounce, too early.
Mm-hmm.
But they
Mm-hmm.
should, I think, be aware of the issues and try to protect themselves from problems. But another thing that occurs to me is this, that I think this varies from country to country, partially because of tax treaties. There
Mm-hmm.
are certain treaties where U.S. citizenship is a benefit. For example, the most well known is the France U.S. tax treaty that actually, gives that prevents tax from France from taxing U.S. investment source income received by U.S. citizens who are resident in France, right?
Nice.
So,
Yeah,
I mean, like this is a huge benefit, right?
that's right.
That I think people need to keep in mind that isn't U.S. citizenship an amazing thing? How like it runs through every aspect of your life.
That's right. It does, John. It does. But I think people are not fully aware of the issues, and that's what we're trying to educate them about. I mean, there's so many people online that say, oh, don't ever register, don't ever file a tax return. And, they're charging for this advice. And I have to say, well, people should be really looking for another advisor.
Well, look, I mean, we understand the technicalities, all the spin-offs that I think probably a lot of people don't. But I wanted to actually something you just said a minute ago triggered my memory of your article on your blog yesterday about the issue of U.S. citizen spouses. Now, maybe we'll keep that one for a separate podcast, but wow, I mean, that one really shows you how U.S. citizenship percolates through the family. Maybe just a brief description of that before we call it a day on this one. Well, we'll tee this up for the next podcast.
Well, I think when people do have a U.S. citizen spouse, especially, for example, if they're living in a community property jurisdiction, I think that was the blog post you're referring to,
Yeah,
John.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, oh my gosh, so much is implicated there. The U.S. citizen thinks, well, my foreign spouse has their own separate bank accounts and investments, and I have my stuff, and I just report my stuff. And they're not realizing if they're living in a community property jurisdiction that, hey, half of the assets of the foreign spouse can be treated under the law as owned by the U.S. citizen, which will implicate FBAR, Form 8938, possibly, PFIC, controlled foreign corporation issues, or at least filings about foreign corporation ownership and
Net worth on renunciation.
net worth on renunciation. I mean, the list goes on. And the even scarier thing is that once people have lived in a community property jurisdiction and they leave and move to a separate property jurisdiction, they may be thinking they're no longer involved with the community property regime, but that might not necessarily be the case. Sometimes, it carries over. And you need to really look. Do you need to do something to get out of that community property regime when you move to a separate property jurisdiction? What do you have to do? You really need to get the proper advice from, family lawyer in that jurisdiction, local counsel. So the implications are huge. Most of the time, in the cases I've seen, the professionals aren't thinking about these issues, and surely the client isn't.
Well, when these issues arise, there is never a small problem. Okay. Why
That's
don't we
right.
put it that way? There is no such thing as a small problem in this area. This has been an interesting discussion this morning. I just realized what the definition of U.S. citizen, if you were to look up U.S. citizen in the dictionary, here's what the definition should be: a carbon life form who needs a lawyer in their life 24/7.
I
What do you
love it.
think?
Yes. Well, John, we do need to have another discussion on the U.S. citizen spouse and community property
Yeah,
because
no, I think that'd be a good one. I mean, that's one that affects just exponentially more people than are aware of it.
that's correct.
Fascinating. And it adds a whole new level of complexity to expatriation as well, interestingly.
Yep. Yep.
Well, wow, this has been, what a wonderful day. What a wonderful way to start a nice fall day in Toronto.
Right. Well, John, I'm wrapping up for the evening in Dubai, and I wish you a wonderful day ahead. And I hope
Uh,
that listeners can learn more. And if they want to check out my U.S. tax blog, it's full of great information.
and absolutely. I think it should be I think that US let's retitle your blog Required Reading for US Citizens.
Well, it's interesting. Uh, a law firm actually wrote to me and said, your blogs are required reading for our lawyers.
Oh no, no, no. We need to get this out on the retail level, Virginia. Why should only lawyers be exposed to these pearls of wisdom? No.
No, I agree. I agree.
It
But
should be for the general public. In fact, I
my
think the
blogs are written for the general public. They're
well,
the
they
ones.
are. Well, that's why I sort of think of you as this is a takeoff of a British Airways ad from maybe it's still as the world's favorite tax lawyer.
Oh, well, thanks, John.
But anyway, this is great. So, what's the blog address? How do people find it?
Okay, very simple. www.us-tax.org. So a hyphen is just a little dash. It's not an underscore. And yeah, very easy to find.
Uh,
us-tax.org.
a hyphen is a dash that connects two letters in the middle of the letters, right?
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
All right. All right, Virginia, this has been great, great, good discussion. And I hope people listen to this because I think this was actually an extremely valuable discussion for people on that
Yeah.
retail level.
I'm planning to perhaps write a Forbes article on this discussion because I think it will interest a lot of people who are, U.S. citizens living overseas and having babies.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. Canada, 2 weeks from now, should have a new law that basically covers a lot of these issues as well in the Canadian context. But of course, they don't have citizenship taxation. So,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, all right, Virginia.
Thanks,
Great.
John.
Thank you
Uh,
very much.
Look forward to the next blog and look forward to our next podcast.
Absolutely.